token authentication. So there we understood about the JSON Web Token, that is JWT, which is a standard to create the access tokens. Then we understood about the various methods of JWT, one of which is sign, using which we can create the JWT token. Another method is verify, using which we can verify the JWT token. Coming to today's session. In this session, we are going to see about the middleware functions in Express.js. We'll also write a new Goodreads API, which is getUserProfile API. So to set the code playground for today's session, you need to run this command, navigate to the my app directory and run the npm install. Okay, now let's get started. So we already know about the getbooks API, right? So where firstly, we are authenticating the JWT token. So once the authentication is done and once the token is valid, so only then we are fetching the data from the database and sending it as a response. Okay. Similarly, let's say we want to add authentication to the getbook API also, right? That is, only the users of the Goodreads.com website should be able to view the details of a book. So we want to add a feature like that. So for that, what do we have to do? We have to add the JWT token verification logic to the getbook API, right? We need to add this logic to the getbook API. So let's do that, okay? So already in the getbooks API, we have that code. So we can directly copy paste that and add it to the getbook API, okay? Clear? Let's try this out, okay? So now you can see, right? So there's getbooks API, there's getbook API, there are various APIs here, right? So let's see the getbooks API. So there you can see, initially, there is a lot of code, right? This is just related to the JWT authentication, right? Which we already have seen in the previous session. Okay, so when the token is valid, then we are getting the data from the database and sending it as a response. Okay, now just like this, we also want to add this authentication part to the getbook API. Okay, so let's do that. So all this part of code will remain the same, right? That is fetching the JWT token, checking whether it's valid or not. All these steps will remain the same, right? So let's try to add that part. Okay. So I'll just copy this to the getbook API. Let me add that. Okay. So then just when the token is valid, right, what we have to do is the data that we are going to fetch will just vary, right? That step I'm going to change. That's it. Okay, clear? So the remaining part of code, there you can see all this is the same. Similarly, now let's say we want to add this authentication part to the, say, AdBook API or say UpdateBook API or the various other APIs. So for every API where we want to add this authentication step, so for all of this, we need to add this piece of code, right? So as you can see, right, a lot of redundant code will be present, right? So if we keep on adding code like this piece of code, which is the same, right? So if we keep on adding to the every API, then what will happen? A lot of redundant code will get added. So how do we avoid it, right? This is not the solution. So how do we avoid it? Okay, so let's understand that. So for every API where we want to add this verification logic, right? So we have to add this piece of code. So there's a lot of redundancy, that also we understood. So we can avoid this by making use of middleware functions. Okay, so let's understand how. Okay, so the authentication part of code, right? So let's create a function, say verify user, okay, where the JWT token will get authenticated. Okay, that is where it will be verified, whether it's valid or not. So when a request has come to the server, so firstly, the request will be sent to the verify user. Okay, then the verify user, that function, will authenticate the JWT token, will check whether it's valid or not. Okay, so in case if it is invalid, so it will directly send a 400, a failure response to the client. Okay, so in case if it is valid, on success of verification, then the actual API handler will get called. So then appropriately in the API handler, so we can fetch the data from the database and send it as a response, right? So here we have commented out the functionality of the JWT token authentication, right? We have made it common. We have created a function for that, okay? So before the API handler being called, right? So directly this function will be called and where the token will be authenticated and appropriately, right? So it will ensure whether to directly send a response to the client or call the API handler, right? Between the client and the API handler. Okay, so first these middleware functions will process a request and then the API handler. Okay, so this will accept the request either from the client or it could be a previous middleware function, right? So we can actually have multiple middleware functions. So either it would accept the request from the client or the previous middleware function. So then the middleware function will process the request. Once the processing is done, so then the middleware function will send the response either to another middleware function if there's another one, or it will call the API handler, the corresponding API handler, or it will send the response to the client. In case of failure, it can directly send a response to the client, right? In this manner. There you can see a case where we have multiple middleware functions, right? So firstly, we have a request. Okay, so then it has been sent to the middleware function 1. Okay, so then it will process that request and send the response to the next middleware functions as arguments here. Okay, so then we'll specify the middleware functions, and the final thing is the API handler. Okay, at the end we'll have the API handler. The first argument will be the path, and then we'll have the middleware functions, whichever we want, and then finally the last argument will be the API handler. Okay, clear? So now we'll understand this even more better with the help of an example. Now let's say we want to add a longer middleware function to our API call. Okay, so let's see how. Firstly, we need to write the middleware function, right? So for that, there you can see, so const, there's a middleware function equal to, coming to the syntax. So the express.js will send the request and the response as the arguments, right? Just like how in the API handler will send the request and the response as the arguments, right? Similarly, so here also the request and the response will be sent as the arguments. Additionally, another argument will be sent, which is next. Okay, so here in this argument, so we'll have the function that needs to be called after the middleware function, right? So we understood there's a chain, right? A request from the client will be sent to the middleware, say another middleware, and finally the API handler in this manner, right? So the next function that needs to be called, it could be another middleware function or it could be the API handler. So that will be passed in the next variable. Okay, so the next function that needs to be called will be present in the next argument, in that argument next. Okay, clear? So the express.js will pass the request, response, and the next function that needs to be executed as arguments to the middleware function. Okay, clear? So now what we'll do is we'll create a logger middleware function. So there you can see logger, for which the request, response, and the next are the arguments. And then inside that we just want to print the request.query. Okay, we are printing that. Clear? Okay, now we have created the middleware function. The next step is we have to specify this middleware function, right? So let's pass the middleware function to the API. Okay, so there you can see we have the path /books as the first argument. So the next thing is we have to specify the middleware function there, which is logger. Okay, there you can see we have specified. And finally, the last argument is the API handler, right, that we have written, for which we have the request, response as arguments, and where we are doing all this various things related to that API. Okay, clear? So here we have passed the middleware function. Okay, clear? We'll also add another console log statement for a better understanding, say console log of getBooks API. Okay, and let's understand what will happen here. Okay, so here in the index.js file, right? So here we have the getBooks API. So for this API, we want to add a middleware function, right? So firstly, let's write the middleware function. So for that, we write const logger equal to, so the express.js will pass 3 arguments. The first argument is request. The second argument is response. Along with this, another argument is next. Okay, so this is basically the function that needs to be called after this middleware function. So the express.js will by default pass the request, response, and the next function that needs to be called as the arguments. So for this, we have written, right? So here we just want to print the request.query object. Okay, clear? So we are done with this, right? So writing the middleware function is done. But we need to specify this in the API, right? So let's say for the getBooks API, we want this middleware function, right? So in this, in app.getOff, the first argument is the path. Then we'll specify the middleware functions. So here we just have one middleware function, which is logger, and we have specified that. And finally, at the end, we'll have the API handler, which is this. Okay, clear? In case if you have multiple middleware functions, you can add them here with comma separated as the various arguments to that. Okay, clear? So we are done specifying the middleware function, right? Okay, so now let's test this. Okay, so let me save this. Okay, so here firstly we need to run the server. So node.mod index.js. So my server start running. So now to the goodread.http, there you can see we have this API. So before calling this, as we understood, we have to first log in, right? So that step is important. So let's do that. So firstly, we'll log in, we'll send request. So we got the JWT token. So let's copy this token. So then we'll add this to the authorization header right here. So we need to add that. Okay, so I'm done adding that. Okay, so there you can see. So we have the authorization appropriately bearer and the JWT token. Okay, so the next thing is let's send the request. As we are printing the query object, so let's just do search_queue equal to Potter. Let's specify one. Okay, so I'm saving it. Now let's send the request. So there you can see we can see the search_queue as Potter, that query object. But we didn't get any response. Now let's check whether the API is being called or not. Actually, we should get a response, right? But we didn't get. So let's add a console log statement here. So get books API. Okay, save this. Okay, now let's again send the request. So you can see again the request the request.query object has been printed, but so the console log statement where we are printing the getBooks API has not been executed. It means that this API itself, this API handler itself is not being called. This handler itself is not being called, right? So why is that? So, right, let's understand. So the reason here is that, so we got this, we have sent this request and we have got the request.query object. So appropriately the middleware function has been executed, but the API handler hasn't been called. So the reason is because in the middleware function, we haven't called the next function, right? So as we understood, the express will send the next function to be executed as the next argument, right? The third argument. Okay, so we haven't called that. So that's the reason. So after the logger, what is the next thing that needs to be executed? API handler, right? The request will come to the logger, which is a middleware function. So that's the only middleware function. So the next thing that has to be executed is the API handler. That will be passed to that variable next, right? But we haven't called it. That's the reason. So if you once you call this, so you will get a response in this manner, and even the getBooks API console log statement will get executed. Okay, so let's try this out. Okay, so now here, so as we understood, right, in the logger, which is a middleware function, we haven't called the next. So that's the reason the API handler hasn't been executed. So now let's save this and then let's send the request. So there you can see we got the response, and also here you can see we got getBooks API. The console log also has been executed. Okay, so we understood this step. Okay, so now coming back to our main issue, right, which was we wanted a verification to be done for various APIs. So for that, we want a middleware function, right, to verify the JWT token. So let's start writing that. Okay, so here we want to authenticate the token, right? So we are writing a middleware function for that. So request, response, and next as the arguments. So now the entire JWT verification code has to be moved to this middleware function. So let's remove that from the getBooks API and let's add that to the authenticate token. So here, once the token is valid, right? So we are making a call to the database, getting the data and sending the response, right? So that piece of code is specific to the getBooks API. So that should be moved to the getBooks API handler. Okay, so we have moved that. Okay, this step is done. Okay, so now here coming to calling the handler, right? So now after the token verification is successful, right? So if the token is valid, right? So then what do we have to do? We have to call the API handler. So for that, so we have to do this next off. Okay, clear? So next thing is we have to specify this middleware in the API. So we have appropriately specified that. Okay, so these steps are done. So it's simple, right? So with this, we are done with defining the authenticate token middleware function. So we have specified in the API, and we can easily authenticate the JWT token for various APIs using this authenticate token middleware function. Okay, so let's try this out. Okay. So now as we understood, so we want to add a middleware function to authenticate the token. Okay, so authenticate token is a middleware function. So 3 arguments: request, response, and then next. Okay, so here in this we have to add the JWT token authentication step, right? So let's add that part, which is all this part of code. Okay, let's copy that. So I'm adding that into this. Okay, so there you can see. So here, if you see, so if the token is valid, right? So we have to basically making this is specific to the getBooks API, right? So calling the database and sending the response. So that shouldn't be present in the middleware function. That should be moved back to the getBooks API. Okay, we are done moving that back. Okay, clear? So there you can see. So we are done moving that back. Okay. So here what we have to do. So if the token authentication is successful, if the token is valid, then we have to call the API handler. So how do we do that? So it's present in the next variable. So we have to just make use of that and call it in this manner. Okay. So with this, the corresponding API handler will get called, and then the necessary steps will be done. Okay. So this is the middleware function. So where we authenticate, and then if it's valid, right? So we call the API handler. In case if the token is invalid, then we directly send a bad request response to the client. Okay, there you can see. So in case if it's not valid, we are directly sending the response to the client. So only when it is valid, we are calling the API handler. Okay, clear? So this step is done, right? Okay. So now next is we have to specify this middleware function in the API. So how do we do it? So here we no longer need this. So we'll just write in this manner. Okay, we are done specifying. Okay, now whenever we get a request to the path/books, firstly, it will go to the middleware function. The middleware function will authenticate the JWT token. So if the token is valid, so then the API handler will get called. Okay, so now it's simple, right? So this entire authentication step code has been commented out, and it is present in the authenticate token middleware function. So here we can make use of this in various other APIs wherever we want to verify the token. Okay, So now let's save this. So we have made some changes. So now let's check this API. So let's send the request. Okay. So and there you can see we have the response. Okay, clear? So we understood these steps, right? Okay. So this step is done. Okay. So there you can see we have sent a request and we got this response, right? So in case if the token that we have provided is invalid, so we'll get an invalid JWT token as the message. Okay, we can try that out. So we'll save this and send a request and you can see invalid access token. Okay. So we are done with this, right? Now what we can do, so we understood the flow, right? So firstly, the request from the client will arrive. So firstly, it will be sent to the middleware function, right? So then the middleware function will verify the JWT token. So if the JWT token is valid, only then the API handler will get called and then API handler will send the response. In case if the JWT token is invalid, then directly the middleware function itself will send the failure response to the client, okay? So we can make use of this middleware function authenticate token in various other APIs, like say we want to create books or we want to update a particular book or delete a book, like this in various APIs. Wherever we want, we can make use of this middleware function. So the redundancy is lost, right? We can directly make use of this middleware function. This is the advantage. Actually, another point to note is we previously actually used a middleware function which was express.json, right? This is actually a middleware built-in, it's a built-in middleware function. Okay, so it will actually recognize the incoming request object as a JSON object. It will parse it and then call the handler of that API call. Okay, so here, since we have written app.use of express.json, so this middleware function will get applied to all the APIs there. Okay, so here this express.json is a middleware function. So since we have written app.use, it got applied to all the APIs and it will recognize the incoming request object as a JSON object and parse it and appropriately call the API handler. Okay, clear? So we understood about the middleware functions, right? Okay. Now let's add a get user profile API, a new API. Okay. So let's write this API to fetch the user details. Let's say we want to build a profile page or something like that. So for that, we need to get the user details. Okay. Let's write an API for this. So the question here is, how do we identify a user using the JWT token? So now the client sends the JWT token, right? So using the verify function, we verify whether the token is valid or not. That is, we are checking whether there is a user or not. Okay, but how do we identify the specific user? Who the user is exactly? Like let's say we want to know the username or something like that. How do we do it? So there is actually a way for that, okay, which is payload, okay. So previously, when we were creating the JWT token, we have made use of the username, right? Remember? So we have put the username as the payload, using which we generated the JWT token, right? So when we are verifying the JWT token, when we provide the JWT token and the secret key, so if the token is valid, then the corresponding payload will be returned, okay. So in the payload, what will we have? We'll have the username, right? Because when we were generating the JWT token, we have stored the username. Okay, we have made use of that username to generate the token. So when we are verifying, we can get back the payload. Okay, so that is we can get the username. So using the username, we can fetch the user details, right? So you understood the way about how to get the user details using the JWT token, right? We can identify the user using the JWT token with the help of the payload, since in the payload, we have specified the username. That's the reason we are able to get the username. Okay, clear? So now let's write the user profile API. So firstly app dot, we are getting the user details. So the HTTP method would be get. So then coming to the path, it is /profile/, okay. And then there we have written the handler. So it's request response, okay. So for this, so as we understood, we want to do the authentication step. So we'll specify that middleware function as authenticate token, okay. So now coming to fetching the user details. So to fetch the user details from the database, we need the username. So the username is present in the payload of the JWT token. So how do we get the payload? We get the payload when we verify, right? So when we verify the JWT token, so if it is valid, we get the payload, right? So where are we verifying the JWT token? In the authenticate middleware function, right? So there you can see, we have the console log of payload. So let's try these steps, okay? So I'm going to the index.js file. So we are done writing these APIs. Now we want to write a new API, which is user profile API. Okay. So app.get of /profile. So this is the part /profile/. And then the next thing is we want to mention the API handler, request, response. Okay. So here, for this, we want to add the authentication step. So let's provide that middleware function, authenticate token. Okay. So now next thing is in the user profile, from the database, we want to fetch the user details. So for that, we need the username. How do we get the username? The username is stored in the payload. Okay, so when we were actually generating the access token, so if you remember in the login API, when we were generating the access token, in the payload, we have the username. Okay, so how do we access the username? So when we are verifying the JWT token, where are we verifying? In the middleware function, right? In the authenticate token middleware function. So here, when we are verifying the JWT token, right? So if the verification is successful, right? If the token is valid, so then we'll get the payload. So let's try to print that, okay? So now let's try to send a request. So so for this, let's try to send the request. And there you can see, right? This is the payload, right? So we have the username as Rahul123 and there's something else. So here we got the username, right? So in this way, we can get the payload. Okay. So we got the payload and from the payload, we even got the username. Okay. So that step is done. Okay. So we have seen this result. Okay. So here, there's one point to know, that is, so when we get a request from the client, so the request object will be sent by default to the middleware functions and finally to the API handler. So Express.js will by default send this request object to the middleware functions and also to the handler. Even the response object will be sent to the middleware functions and finally the handler. We know, right? By default, the Express.js sends the request response as the arguments. Okay. So here, this one thing is that we cannot directly pass the data to the next handler. So here in our case, we want to pass the username, right, which is present in the middleware function. We want to pass that to the API handler, but we cannot directly pass this data to the next handler. But there is a way. We can actually send the data through the request object. So as we understood, the request object will be sent by default. Okay, so the request object will be sent to the middleware functions and the API handler by default. We cannot pass data, but we can make use of the request object. Okay. So for that, what we can do is we can write request dot and we can specify variable and we can assign the payload data to it. Okay. So here in our case, we want to pass the username. So we can write request dot username equal to payload dot username. In this way, we can pass the username to the API handler. Okay. Clear? So then in the API handler, we can extract the username through object destructuring. There you can see. So once we get the username, there you can see if we print, we'll get a response in this manner. Okay. Shall we try this out? Okay. So here, so in the payload, as we understood, we got the username. So now we have to send this username to the API handler. So we cannot directly send the data to the next handler or the next middleware function, but we can make use of the request object as we understood, right? So we can write request dot and we can provide the variable. So here it's the username. So we'll write username equal to payload dot username. Okay. So in this way, we are passing the username in the request object. Now we have to make use of this username in the user profile API, right? So let's go to that handler. So this is the handler. So here, let's access it. Okay, let username equal to request. Okay, so through object destructuring, we are getting the username. Okay, so the next thing is using the username, we have to fetch the data from the database. Before that, let's print it. So console.log of username. Okay, so now let's send the request. Okay, so for that, firstly, we need to write a call here. So I'm adding 3 hashes. Now we'll start with, firstly, the method is get, okay? And then coming to the URL, it's http localhost / profile /, right? So this is it. Okay, and coming to the authorization. So here, just like how we have authorization here, we'll just add the same authorization. So here you can see, we are done adding the authorization also, okay? So now let's send the request. I'm saving it, I'm sending the request. And there you can see, I can see the username, which is Rahul123, right? That's what we have logged in with, right? Rahul123. So we got the username. Okay. So now, so we have seen this result, right? So the next thing is using the username, we have to fetch the details from the database. So there you can see, select user query, select star from user, where username equal to this. Okay. So with this, we'll execute that on the database, db.get. Since we are getting a single row, so we are using the get method. So db.get of select user query. With this, we'll get the user details. And we have to send this user details as the response. So response.send of user details. Okay. So let's give this a try. Okay. So we got appropriately the username. So the next thing is we have to make use of this username and send the request, right? So const select user query. Okay. Which is select start from user where, so the username should match, right? Username equal to $, it's present in the username variable. Okay. So this is the SQL query that needs to be executed, right? So the next thing is we have to run this on the database. So db.get of select user query. Okay. So we'll await on this. And then finally, we'll get the DB user. Okay, we'll get the user details. Okay. Equal to this. Okay. And then let's send, no need to this, just directly send the response. So these steps are done, right? So shall we try this out? Okay. So let me send the request and you can see I got the user details as the response. So the username is this, name, password, gender, all this is present. Okay, clear? So we understood about this API, right? So we are done with writing the get user profile API. We have sent a request in this manner and we got this response. Okay. So here one point to note is generally in the payload, when we are creating a JWT token, in the payload, we add the details using which we can identify the user, right? Generally the token is specific to a user, specific to a client, right? So we generally add the details that help us identify the user. This is just one important point to note. Just like how we added username, right? Like this, we add details to identify the user in the payload. Okay, so let me summarize today's session. So in today's session, we understood about the middleware functions, right? So we have written a middleware function to authenticate the JWT token. So then we have written a get user profile API. So using which we understood about how to make use of the payload and how to pass it